Okay, very good. Let's start. So first of all, very, very warm welcome to you all. We actually had a tremendous response. Nearly 250 people registered, which was really interesting. I mean, it says a lot, I think, about the current state of things that a webinar on awakening and healing would attract that kind of interest. So very warm welcome from me. I propose to speak. We'll do some meditation together. We'll maybe have some short time in triads and maybe. So maybe we'll just start. We'll do a more longer meditation a bit later, but let's start just with a moment of quiet. And if you feel comfortable to do so, just to close your eyes for a moment. And let's do the most simple practice of all, which is just to notice our breathing. So simply to pay attention to exactly what's happening in your body as you breathe in and as you breathe out. The obvious movements, the obvious. So it doesn't matter how active your mind is. We're simply choosing to pay attention. And if you wish, you can also very gently soften the out-breath, relax the out-breath. This may bring you a sense of just settling more. Settling in your chair, settling in your pelvis, your legs. And just noticing breathing. And perhaps you may also just remind yourself or even see in this moment what's new about what brings you here today. Good. Okay. Good. Thank you. So there's a lot to say, and I think I'm going to start in a very simple way, because there is having been working for so many years, there are certain things that become actually very simple and yet contain a lot of substance. And I want to start by saying that I work with leaders from all over the world, so from many, many cultures. And there is at least one thing that is universal. And I think it's right at the heart of the current crises that we are in. And it's to do with our consciousness. And the simplest way I would put it is to reference one of the many gifts Einstein gave us when he asked the question, is your mind your master or your servant? Is your mind, is our mind, our master or our servant? Because the answer to that question changes a huge amount. It changes a huge amount of how we are in the world and how we experience what we call reality. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that in all the leaders I meet from all over the world, at least 95%, the answer is the mind is the master. The mind is the master, meaning the thinking mind is the faculty. It's the thing we do most. It's the primary tool we use to navigate. And I believe that's a catastrophic imbalance, because the mind as a master means that we actually end up living in a very reduced version of reality. Our perceptual field is very small, and I really mean that very literally. Our perceptual field is small, because the thinking mind, extraordinary tool and servant as it is, does not actually experience the world. I think that's very striking and very important to see that. The thinking mind thinks about everything, but it has no direct experience. And we find, for instance, with many adults, if you ask an adult, can you tell me how you're feeling right now emotionally? Mostly what we will get is thinking. Even when the sentence starts, I feel. And to really see this becomes a very important part of the process of development. And we're here to look at really what is development, what is the leadership that is needed now, and what does awakening and healing mean as two pillars within the path of development. So I want to talk about both those pillars. And I want to put it all in this context of breaking out of our limited perceptual field. I would argue that most leaders are working with only about 20% of their full capacity. Because when the thinking mind is dominant, it usually means that whole other parts of us are offline, like not included. And that goes back a long way. That started when we were much younger, when we were, let's say, our whole being was more alive and engaged. And little by little, and this is encouraged in our education from very early on, as thinking becomes sovereign, our body starts to go offline. The aliveness of our body starts to go offline. And it's not just aliveness in our body, it's that our body is an unbelievable instrument of knowing, of receiving information, far more than we realize, far more than is ever discussed in our culture. So the body goes offline. Our emotions tend to close down because in our environments as children, our full emotional range was often not welcome. So that starts to close down. And so the energy that we are as human beings becomes more and more limited. And then thinking is taught as the most sovereign faculty. So in essence, it's like we walk around from here. We walk around from here. And of course, when people exercise, when they go to a good exercise class, everyone knows that at least for a few minutes after you come out of an exercise class, whatever it is, reality is different. literally reality is different. You feel different, you feel more alive, and your perception of the world is different. Or when I ask a group of leaders to remember how that feels, and everyone can remember how that feels, and then I say, so what percentage of your day do you have that feeling of physical aliveness? There's a kind of dull shock in the room. Because the answer is usually around 5%, maybe 10%. But the problem is we've normalized that. We have normalized that. And the first step in waking up is to really see that, to see how much we've normalized that. And it's quite shocking to realize that, how much we've limited ourselves and how much we buy into that collectively. Somehow we accept that that's the way it is. So when we're speaking about awakening and healing as two core pillars of development, another way of looking at what we're talking about is how big does my circle of inclusion become? How much of me is really included? And how much of what reality is and might be is really included in all directions? So when I speak of awakening, I mean how much do we go into more and more open realms of consciousness, more and more expanded realms of consciousness, more and more non-dual realms of consciousness, where I really experience an enormous space and a lessening of my whole experience of separation and access to all kinds of subtle information, subtle insights, subtle new ideas. That's part of the awakening stream. And that's not enough on its own, because we also need to go down. We also need to go down into what I call the healing stream, because that's where we need to directly meet the parts of us that got very contracted in our development. They got very contracted, often on an emotional level. Because when we were children, if part of our emotionality was not recognized or criticized or was basically unwelcome, the only thing we could do was to freeze it, because we had to fit in. It's the fundamental need of the child to fit in. And we did that at the expense of our deeper self. We fitted in, and we turned off a lot of our emotional energy because it wasn't welcomed, wasn't supported. And then we look at not just our personal energy, but we look at the whole stream that we're born into, our lineage, and we understand that we are also carrying the patterning of that ecosystem. So if whole parts of the ecosystem were cut off in previous generations, there's a very high chance that I'm also carrying some of that, as well as more collective layers of the ecosystem, depending on my nationality, my tribe, the circumstances of my background. So the healing stream, and this is the one that's often most or least really addressed, is that we need to go into and feel those parts of us that have closed down. And it's not enough to do that cognitively, it's not enough to do that analytically, it's not enough to do that primarily through cognition. It has to be a much more direct process, or that energy remains frozen. We will never think our way through unfreezing that energy, however much we try. And we really try. We really try. We will also not unfreeze that energy by meditating more, even though some meditators will tell you that that does heal that energy. I don't believe, well, in my experience, it definitely doesn't. It's nice to believe that it would, because then we can all exist in a kind of, yes, I'm fine, I'm really fine, I feel very peaceful, and so on and so forth. But actually, there's still a lot of contraction inside. And that contraction needs to be met. And for that to be met, we need to have a mentor or a coach or a guide who's holding the space for that. Holding the space. Otherwise, my own regulation system prevents me from going to those more uncomfortable parts of myself. I can never go there on my own. I have to have someone holding the space. So in my view, leaders who really want to responsibly develop themselves to be the kinds of leaders we need now, need to engage both those streams. They need to engage a stream of awakening, and they need to engage the stream of healing, which of course also are interdependent in many ways. Because very often when we do what we might call some kind of healing work, our whole system naturally opens, and suddenly we feel much more connected. We feel much more open. So that's the kind of work that I do with leaders, whether it's individual or in groups, and it brings people into what I call whole self intelligence, which means that all parts of us are engaged. And then we begin to realize something really extraordinary that one of my mentors said to me 5, 6, 7 years ago. And when he said it, I was like, oh, wow, really? And he said that we are in a constant information field, that all the information is available all the time about everything. Well, that kind of sounds extraordinary. It's what all mystical traditions have said, and it's what key parts of the quantum science field tell us as well. But actually what happens as we begin to really open through the awakening and through the healing is that becomes real. That becomes real. So in the coaching training I do, for instance, we really dive into the reality of that I sit with somebody and without any kind of language initially, I notice I can feel a huge amount about this person. Huge amount. Without knowing any biographical details about them. And then we understand that that's actually our natural state. That's how we're supposed to be. And I was running a more advanced coaching retreat recently. And we did things like people sat with their eyes closed in front of someone and began to notice how much of that person they could feel. How much in real detail and correctly. This is not some kind of subjective, well, I feel this. No. We're talking about really precise, accurate knowing. This is what it means when our perceptual field opens. And how small a perceptual field we've come to normalize and call reality. So in leadership, this opens a totally different playing field. I was also working intensively with a couple of leaders just this last week. And I invited one of them I was working one-to-one with him, and I invited him to tune in to someone in his team who was having some issues and to noticed that if he wanted to, he could really feel absolutely inside that person. And he was completely shocked by what happened. He was like, oh, because he was really inside, feeling all the emotions of that person. This is how we naturally are. So we're talking about a much higher level of leadership here, a much higher level of functioning, a much higher navigational capacity, a much, much bigger space. And you hear it said now that a lot of leadership is about what space do you hold? What space do you hold? How big a space do you hold? And what kind of transmission do you have as a leader? How do you show up in a way that holds a big space for people? And so a very important part of that is our emotional world. And it's a core part of the work I do that we absolutely need to rewrite and delete the whole idea that there are positive or negative emotions. I think that's one of the biggest kind of vice grips we live in. And I have to get rid of my negative emotions and somehow not include those. No, that's really, really needs to be deleted. Because emotions are pure life energy. Almost everyone is carrying anxiety now of some kind or another. It would be unusual to find someone who said, no, I have no anxiety at all, whether that's personal, whether it's professional, whether it's about the state of the world. Anxiety is not a problem. The only problem with anxiety is when we think we shouldn't feel it and we want to get rid of it. And we say, oh, well, fear blocks me, so it'd be better if I got rid of it. Because actually what happens very simply is when we make space to just feel without analyzing, without explaining. And that's already a big step because our thinking mind always wants to come in and analyze and explain. But if we actually just make space to feel something like anxiety, and we feel held and warmly received in that, within a very short space of time, we usually feel very alive, very embodied. Our body comes alive. People often say, wow, I feel my legs now, and so on and so forth. So this becomes very important in leadership. You imagine a leader who's running a meeting, and it's obvious that there's a lot of tension in the room. So does she or he, as the leader, continue as if that wasn't happening? Or does she or he pause for a moment and just say, let's just acknowledge that there's a lot of anxiety here. I'm feeling it too. And I'm sure many of you are, and it's okay. Let's just welcome that, accept it. Because in that moment, what will happen is a collective relaxation, a collective movement, like a sigh of relief. And most importantly, the critical thinking after that will be at a much higher level. Much higher level. People will start to have ideas. I've seen this happen time and time again. When a whole team can sit together in small groups and the topic is, let's talk about what we're afraid of right now. And they do that. And then they report back and they're all like, no, it was unbelievable how many new ideas we had after we did that. So this whole notion that something like fear and anxiety blocks us needs to be deleted. The problem is what we block. If we block our tears, then we're blocking our natural empathy and compassion. And then we have to learn empathy skills, which is one of the most ridiculous things, that we might have to learn how to be empathic. This is a sign of how crazily imbalanced we are. Let's make that a skill. When it's the natural human nature is to be empathic, to resonate with people, to care. And if we block our sadness, for sure, we're also closing down that faculty in us. And as leaders, I often speak about the need to have robust vulnerability. I think it's a very beautiful quality in a leader, robust vulnerability, which means that as a leader, you will show when you feel emotional and when it feels appropriate and will be useful for people. You will show that you have an emotion, that you're feeling an emotion, but you'll do so in a robust way, meaning people don't have any worry that you're somehow going to fall apart or be overwhelmed by your emotion. That's a huge quality in a leader because it's legitimizing. It's legitimizing. It's always about widening the circle. It's always about holding a bigger space. Because when people's emotions are legitimized in that way without being needing to be fixed or analyzed, there's an enormous connection energy that opens up. It's like teams who begin their meetings. Well, there are two practices that I hear more and more of, which a few years ago were rare. One is to begin a meeting with 1 or 2 minutes silence. This happens, I hear more and more. And it's very simple. Why do that? Because afterwards, there's a much higher level of conversation. This has to be built because naturally some people will really not like that. And it's very natural. And why will people not like starting a meeting with 2 minutes silence? Because suddenly they'll notice how they're feeling inside. They'll notice. And a lot of their speed is keeping them away from feeling. And that has to be totally welcomed, met, absolutely not judged. Just even explain that that's what's happening. But the overall consequence of starting a meeting like that is there's a much higher level of conversation afterwards. So as I sometimes say now, please tell me the business case for not doing that. We don't have time. But that's just ridiculous. That's ridiculous. If 2 minutes silence is going to mean you have a much higher quality conversation, how can you make a business case for not doing that? The only reason not to do that is fear. That what happens inside me when I suddenly stop. And that's totally natural and needs to be welcomed and included. The other practice I hear, and this is really a mature level of team practice, is that a meeting would begin by everyone simply checking in with how they're really feeling. Now that in itself requires a maturity of being able to know what I'm actually really feeling, because a lot of the time we're in a fog. We don't know what we're really feeling. So assuming a team of individuals has developed enough to actually know what they're feeling really and can articulate it precisely and concisely, and everything is welcome. So the leader has done enough work on themselves that they can welcome everything. They can welcome someone saying, I really am irritated to be here, don't want to be here. And the leader will say, thank you. And how are you? I feel great. Thank you. How are you? And so on. And it's understood that what is required is truth, not some kind of I'm fine. Then what happens at the end of that is, first of all, an enormous feeling of presence in the room and connection. And secondly, often the person who said, I don't really want to be here, or I'm actually really irritated to be here, suddenly feels very good. Suddenly feels very good. That's interesting, because they were simply welcomed. Nothing more is needed. If you start going into, why? What's the matter that you don't want to be here? That's not what's needed. This is a very mature, high-performing culture that can really do that. And it takes a leader who can hold a big space, who is not afraid of how people are feeling, because she or he has done enough of their own inner work, has met their own emotional landscapes, and has an unconditional regard for the emotional landscape. Doesn't need to reject some of it. So this comes back to how big a circle do I hold as a leader, and as a coach as well. How big a circle do I hold as a coach? So in one way, we can simply say that we're talking about our nervous systems moving from what's called fight or flight into rest and digest, which is a very, very different experience of the world. And some of this requires a lot of slowing down, but it's a slowing down in order to go fast. That's very interesting. When we really want to go fast, we actually have to have a lot of stillness inside if we don't want to be a headless chicken. To actually really deeply find that quality of being. And that's why I often speak about being and doing. And there's a whole part of my book about that being and doing, if you imagine a triangle and you have being and doing at the two apexes at the bottom, and each has very different characteristics, and at the top is an integration of being and doing. So it's not an either or. It's that there is like an internal bowl of being that we learn to rest in inside, and an arrow of doing that comes out of that bowl of being, which can be very fast or very slow, and above all will be attuned to what's happening around me. Really attuned. It's like if you read about great sports coaches, and you hear that one of the faculties, that one of the characteristics that they all have is that they, in the locker room, they'll speak to every person differently, very differently. Someone they might approach in a very gentle way, someone in a much more fierce way. So either they've trained that or they're just naturally sufficiently present to be able to feel what's in front of me and how do I meet you in the way that will most serve you. That's high-level leadership. And we all know, and I've often asked groups of leaders to remember the leaders they've worked for who they felt really met them, even if briefly, even if in a 1-minute encounter, they felt really met and received. And everyone can remember such leaders, and there are not many of them around. Because most of the time we have far too much of our own mental process on our screen, and that's occupying us. And there's not very much space. There's not very much space to really relate. Because to really relate, I have to have space inside me to receive you. To receive you. So that I don't just hear your words, I feel you. That's relating. That's relating. And if we go back to the notion that actually there's huge information available all the time, it will not be available to me if my nervous system is in fight or flight. I have to be in rest and digest. And then when you talk to me, I will feel you in a very multi-dimensional way. And one of the things, many practices I suggest to leaders is that when they're in a public place, a cafe or airport or wherever they are, put your phone down, tune in, and look around and just Choose a couple of people who are talking and notice how much you can feel of what's going on in each person and what's going on between them. That's totally available to us, depending on our inner level of coherence. And that means our embodiment, our deep embodiment, really coming home to our bodies, which is a lifelong journey, whether it's whatever kind of body work is good for you. It's essential in our development that our body comes back online, and it's literally a lifelong process. And a whole part of that process is coming down in our body, coming back down. Because every time as a child we were not received or shocked in some way, what we did physically was we lifted out of our pelvis and we contracted our pelvis. And we forgot that we did that. We forgot. I was working again with someone very intensively, actually, here in my house a few days ago, and I took him outside and I said, just walk. Well, let me see how you walk. And after 10 seconds, I stopped him and I said, okay, I see. You're walking around like this. You have no connection with your pelvis when you're walking. And he said, wow, you're right. You're right. And then we did some kind of shaking and banging and moving. And he was suddenly walked across the space in a totally different way. And he was like, oh, wow. Because we normalize this. We normalize this way of moving. The animal of our body is very closed. You know that beautiful poem by Mary Oliver, which starts, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. It's one of the most amazing lines of poetry ever. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. And so we have to get right back into our bodies. We have to. This is a fundamental part of our presence. It's a fundamental part of how big a space we hold. And it's also a fundamental access to levels of knowing that are almost completely forgotten in our culture. Types of direct knowing, which our intellectual mind just would totally dismiss as not even being real. But they're very real. They're very, very real. Our body is an instrument of perception. Sports people know this. Indigenous people know this. Our body is a whole way of knowing the world. And we've closed it down at huge expense. We need to bring our emotions back online. We need to have a much more open, fluid relationship with our emotions, of feeling, creating spaces together where it's okay to feel. It's okay to feel. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to be anxious. Sometimes it's very important to be angry. And to ground that anger, not to explode it out, but to really bring the anger down in our body, right back down to our pelvis, for instance, where it becomes huge life force. And then as we work with all of this, we also start to see that our intuition opens. And another kind of knowing that our culture is generally quite dismissive of. And yet most people have moments of intuition where you just know something. It can be very simple. But again, it's a different type of knowing. Some of you may know Einstein's famous, beautiful sentence when he said, our rational mind is a faithful servant and our intuitive mind is a sacred gift. And we have created a society which honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. Amazing statement. And that's so true. That's so true. We honor the servant. We make the rational mind sovereign. And it needs to become our servant. Those of you who know the work of Ian McGilchrist will find a lot of reference here in what I'm saying. And then we need to also have a mindful, meditative practice. Because as we'll maybe feel in a moment if we do some meditating together, the way we pay attention is our biggest developmental tool. The very act of paying attention already changes our brain frequency measurably. This is why mindfulness has become such a widely used function, even if it's a kind of dumbed-down version of the real depth of the tradition it comes from. But it's very interesting that it's become so widespread because it really works. It already creates significant change in us when we really pay attention. Because paying attention has nothing to do with thinking. Paying attention is a totally different faculty. And once we realize that, we have an incredibly powerful tool available to us all the time. And then gradually we also expand our whole perceptual field, and we begin to also touch into what is often spoken about in a very simple way in some of the mystical traditions. One of the images that I most love is when it's said that if you open the page of a book, you have all the black letters, and that's mostly, of course, what we engage with, all the black letters. However, there is also a white page. There is also a white page. And that white page is huge, timeless, and the repository, as it were, of all kinds of information and innovation, just like we say, well, the idea came to me. And so supposing it was the case that part of our real development is to learn to walk in both at the same time, to be fully engaged with the black letters, and also to practice that the white page remains open. The white page remains open. Because otherwise, again, it's like we're lost in a much too small world. The white page and the black letters. And a leader who is operating in that way, again, is operating on a very, very big playing field with huge relational capacity, the possibility of creating cultures that are far more connected, far more energized, and that have far more access to higher levels of innovation and creativity. Because we're in, obviously we're in big crisis now. Many organizations are in crisis. The world is in crisis. And what I hear very often is people saying, we know that much of what has got us to where we are is not quite what is going to get us forward, take us forward, but there's not enough understanding of the limitations of what's got us to where we are and what's really needed to take us forward. And I find a lot in my work that when the kind of map I'm presenting today is really laid out coherently, it makes huge sense for people. I'm giving a lot now in a short space of time. Normally it would be slower. But when this kind of thinking, when this kind of map that I'm speaking about here is really presented to many of the groups of leaders I work with, it makes total sense. And there is also a way forward. And there need to be practices. There need to be very clear practices about what does it mean to really be more present? What does it mean to keep my perceptual field open? And we'll touch on that in a moment. So I think that's more than enough talking from me. Let's do a little longer meditation. Let's do a longer meditation. And just so we can taste a bit this sense of immersing in a bigger field. So if you're comfortable to do so, once again, just gently close your eyes. And immediately, if you're not already doing so, which maybe many of you will be already, just engage the faculty of paying attention. We're not trying to stop thinking, but we are saying, I want to be the person right now who is paying attention. And we start by paying attention to the breathing. Just noticing our breathing exactly as it is, the movements, the subtle sensations. And once again, if you feel comfortable to do so, just to relax the out-breath. Because the out-breath is the one that we habitually for many years have learned to contract. So just see what happens if it feels comfortable for you to lengthen, soften, relax the out-breath. So you feel more contact with your chair. You feel more contact with your base, which in the body is the pelvis. And then let's see if we can just take our attention gently down into our legs. First the top part of the legs. Just noticing whatever sensations we notice. We're becoming curious, it's like a discovery each time, like an inner landscape of sensation. It's always different, so it's always new. And then we take our attention a bit further down into our calves and our ankles, discovering the structure and also the sensations, and then into taking our attention into our feet. Toes, contact with the ground through the soles of our feet. And then we can say, so let me now experience, let me now notice, feel the whole lower half of my body, from my waist down, so my pelvis, my thighs, my calves, my feet, as one unit, like foundation in my body. This would open the landscape of being actually grounded as well, because when I'm not in contact with this part of my body, I cannot be grounded. So we keep using the out-breath just to settle. And then with this feeling of settling, let's include the spine, straight spine, sitting as it were on top of this foundation, right up to my head. And let's for a moment hold in our attention both our feet touching the ground and the center of the top of our head. Just notice sometimes there are sensations there. It's an important energy point in the body, center of the top of the head. And it's like we're greeting, it's like we're saying hello to our body. It's like we're making contact with our body. And then we can move our attention to the center of our forehead. Also another important energy point in some traditions. And just notice if there's any particular sensations there. And then let's notice our eyes and our eye sockets. Again, with a kind of discovery, as if you were noticing for the first time the different sensations in the eyes and the eye sockets. And then let's take our attention to our nose and nostrils and cheekbones. Bring our attention to all the sensations in that part of our face. And then down to our lips and teeth, tongue, and our jaw. To notice this part of the structure of our body. Lips, teeth, tongue, jaw. How incredible it is to have a body. And then let's lastly just include the width of our body, the shoulders, our arms, our wrists and fingers, hands and fingers. And then resting in an inner sensing of the whole body, encompassing the whole body with our attention from the inside and all the different myriad sensations arising moment to moment to moment. Just noticing. And then also noticing that as we do this, on the one hand, there are these constantly changing river of sensations, constantly changing, and at the same time, there's something like a kind of background, another dimension. We can call it a sense of space, or a kind of dimension of silence inside. It's big and very different to all the movement of sensations, and both coexist. But let's notice for a moment together that really much, much bigger space. Like the beginning of the white page. Just see how it is to allow that to grow for a moment. And then to bring our awareness fully to the body again, to your sitting, to your feet, to your breathing. And then we can just introduce one of the most important, what I regard as one of the most important practices of all, which is the maintaining of inner and outer attention simultaneously, so that our attention encompasses everything that's happening inside of us, and at the same time encompasses the outside world effortlessly. So just consider that for a moment with your eyes closed. If it helps, you could begin just to notice sounds that are around you in your space. And notice how you can encompass those in your attention without losing your sense of your interior and all that's happening there. And when you feel ready, maybe invite you to just experiment with opening your eyes a little bit, so suddenly you have this whole world of visual information coming in, and see what you need to do to organize your attention that doesn't pull you out of your inner connection. It's an inner organization. So just I invite you to play with that for a moment until you find how to balance the two so that you're with your interior and the exterior at the same time. Yeah. And just holding that as an internal practice as we come back together with eyes open. Because that is a foundation of presence. And there's a simple practice I teach about anchoring that, which I love to offer you now, because it's very simple, and yet I know from many, many leaders I work with how powerful it is. And it's a teaching I received many, many years ago. It's very simple. And the teacher who taught this to me said, at any one moment, we are either on a forward circle or a backward circle. Simple as that. Either one or the other. So if we kind of practice that together for a moment, and we say, let's get on a forward circle, which means I come up and I go out I go out towards the world. So just try doing that. Breathing in and go out. I want to see you all, so I go out. That's a forward circle. And then a backward circle is I say, okay, let me bring my attention back and down. I breathe out and I settle myself. And then I'm in much more of a backward circle. I'm more here and I'm receiving the world. And his teaching was as simple as it could be. He said, anytime you notice you're on a forward circle, get off it. So I invite people I work with to be aware of that during the day, in any conversation you're in, and reference it physically. Because when you're in a forward circle, you lose a sense of your body. You don't feel down, you don't feel your legs, you don't notice your feet. So you can reference it physically. How is it when you're talking to someone to be in a backward circle, which does not mean you're going slow all the time. Not at all. But it means you're here. And you go as fast as the situation requires you to go, but from here, not from moving out of yourself. This is a very simple, very potent practice. Fundamental definition of presence. I'm here and I'm available. But I'm really here and I'm really available. And available means I'm taking in huge amounts of information about you, about the space, about wherever I am. I'm taking in a lot of information. That's availability. So my simple argument is that this is what real leadership development is, and it must encompass all of the dimensions I've spoken about in order to develop the kind of leadership I believe we most urgently need right now. Leaders who are really present, leaders who are really accessing whole self-intelligence, who are building cultures that operate in that way in a much higher frequency. Leaders who understand that your highest offering as a leader is your vibration. What are you transmitting into the space? Because that's what determines a lot about your culture. And what are we, another way of understanding culture in a team is what are we allowed to talk about? What are we not allowed to talk about? If a team gets conscious about that, you understand a lot about your culture. What are we allowed to say? What are we not allowed to say? What parts of me am I allowed to show or not show? Because actually, I'm almost sure that in every group, on a deeply subconscious level, everyone is navigating that inside. How safe is this space? How safe is it really? And sometimes, to develop real connection, we need to be able to speak about not feeling safe with each other. And for that not to be fixed, but for that to be included. It's always about how much can be included. Very good. So, I'm going to propose that we do some Q&A now. I thought we might do triads, but it feels more like it would be interesting to have some Q&A. So please, anyone who wants to speak, you can raise your hand electronically. You have a raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. I won't see you because there are 5 pages, but if you raise your hand, I'll be able to see you. So please, anyone who'd like to speak. Great, Julia. Just unmute yourself. Yeah, perfect.
Thanks, Nicholas. So
What's coming?
I wanted to know your perspective on, well, I hold an interpretation that sometimes it's hard for people to pay attention to. If we can't change something, we don't notice. And sometimes it's hard to notice something we don't have the words for. So my experience of, learning emotions, I'm talking about learning emotions, not learning about them, but learning them through presencing myself in them, is that it helps to have language. So I'm curious, when you're working with leaders to develop that emotional presencing, how much is literacy a part of that?
Right.
And and the second part of the question is, how do you invite leaders to presence those emotions in their being, in this organism?
Right.
That we call our bodies.
Right. It's such a beautiful and important question, the first part, and then I'll come to the second part. It's so important, this, and because what I notice, quite apart from the emotional realm, which I'll come very directly to in a moment, is that as part of this disconnection that is so widespread in our culture, paradoxically, given how obsessed we are with the rational mind, we speak in a remarkably imprecise way. What do I mean by that? I mean, we throw out words all the time in conversations as if we all understand what they mean. And often I hear that and I say to someone, sorry, no, that word, you just used that word. Can you tell me what you really mean by that word? And within a minute, it's very clear that the word was totally the wrong word. It's really interesting. We've developed this fog in the way we speak. So you're absolutely right that a key part of development is that we have to help each other. I love the word literacy that you use. And we have to relearn that, because most of us were not taught that as children. We were not taught how to give the right language to our emotions. I actually have a colleague in London who has a whole business around going into schools and teaching children how to name their emotions. It's amazing. And then guess what? They go home and they teach their parents, because they realize their parents don't know. So it's very, very important what you're saying. I call it aligning word and energy. Because as we become more literate, and I think it really is that, and we learn the precision of language, and we learn to first notice, okay, something is happening inside me. I know that some emotion is arising. Let me try and find the right words. And we have to really slow down, because the mind will just say, it's this. Now, if you're a good coach, which I'm sure you are, you'll say, no, just a minute. Let's be much more precise here. And usually we have to really slow down. And we educate each other and we help each other to be able to name exactly what's happening. Because when we do that, a lot of movement happens inside us. And we also have to be very careful, in my experience, to stop the because. Meaning, oh, I'm feeling a bit of anxiety because. No. We don't want the because. Because when we go into the because, we already move away from feeling. Let's just feel. And let's feel, first of all, there are many types of anxiety. Let's be more precise. Let's notice what you're really feeling. Because almost always when we do that, our emotion starts to change. And then we discover, oh, there's a whole other layer here as well. And it's an amazing, beautiful precision of literacy that we enter. And again, I come back to when teams are more accurate in how they speak, the energy level changes dramatically. And similarly, when we're imprecise, the energy level really drops. And many people say they come out of meetings feeling depleted. And mostly that's because either there's been no acknowledgement of what's actually happening emotionally, or there's been a lot of empty speaking, empty conceptual speaking. And everyone is kind of acting as if we know what we're talking about. So I think it's of supreme importance, what you're saying. And requires a lot of education. We all have to learn that. We all have to learn. And it's very interesting with young children that if a child is language capable and they're already, let's say, in some kind of emotional state, and you offer them a word and you say, is this what you're feeling? And they say, no, no. And you offer another word, no. That when you offer the precise word, there is a kind of, yeah. So the whole nervous system relaxes because word and energy have become one. This is of such huge importance. And why are we not taught that at school? Now, how different would our culture be if we were taught that at school? One of my mentors said recently, in 50 years' time, we're going to look back at our education and say, really? Really? That's what you were spending your time teaching children? Like nothing really important. Imagine if from an early age we were taught this, how to really be with our emotions and name our emotions. So we have to find together how to do that. And certainly in coaching, it becomes a really critical part. And we're not trying to fix, because once we really name an emotion and embrace it, meaning have no opposition to it, we settle and it moves. It moves naturally. Emotion moves. When we're blocking it or naming it incorrectly, it just gets stuck inside us. And we have to be super aware of how quickly we go into thinking, how quickly we move away into thinking. And even linguistically, when people say, I feel that, no, stop. If you say that, you're going to tell me what you're thinking. I don't feel that. I feel sad a bit, or I feel irritated. So this is just high precision with language as well. And that's why we love good poetry so much. Because good poetry is a marriage of word and energy. And it opens our experience. As do great speakers. When you hear a good speaker, their words are, first of all, they embody their language. And secondly, their words are precise. And in high-level coaching, language is like an acupuncture needle. Like you feel a very deep issue in someone and you name it with absolute precision. And it's like an acupuncture needle. It's a huge skill as a coach. And you're not doing it to intellectually analyze. You're doing it, you're using language to touch a deep energy point in somebody. So thank you. I hope I answered your question, Julia. Thank you for bringing that. Melanie. Hi, Melanie.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you so much. That's a beautiful speech. Thank you for sharing. I had one question regarding, you were talking about the two directions, no? The expansion and the healing, for the opening up and then also the downwards.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why you see that as two different directions, because for me, it's kind of more and more an integration of everything. Well, first you start with, I don't know, rational, emotional, physical, etc. And then you go into also time-wise, when then biographical integration becomes, but you see it as two different directions. And I'd love to hear why, or
Right. I mean, they are, of course, very interconnected. But there are different ways of answering that. One is more metaphysical. So there are a lot of spiritual traditions where the primary intention is to go up, to ascend into the light, let's say, and to kind of leave here. It's around a lot, and there are modern versions of that without naming teachers, but there are teachers who are really teaching that. And it's popular because at worst, we bypass our suffering. It's a way of going up into a kind of, how are you? I'm fine. And I feel very peaceful because I'm up here. But there's another whole tradition which says actually the light has to come right down. And therefore, in order for that to really happen, we have to bring it down into the parts of us that are contracted and where the light got obscured. So in that sense, I would say there's an up and a down. And or I would say that's parallel pillars, but the pillar of what I call healing is very rarely done properly in my experience, because we start to intellectualize and analyze, and it requires a very direct work, and it requires our willingness to be very uncomfortable sometimes and feel what we spent a lot of time not feeling, quite rightly, until we had the safe enough space. So in that sense, I separate the two. I just think it's important to see that they're different and totally related. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Andy.
Hi, Nicholas. It sounds to me so self-evident how valuable what you're talking about is to individual leaders and to their organizations. And yet it isn't very widespread, as you said. I agree with that. So what do you think are the impediments to what you're talking about, to presence, to awareness, to slowing down, to inner healing? What are the impediments to that becoming more widespread than it is now?
That's a great and a huge question. Maybe we can think together a bit. So, I mean, yeah, there are many dimensions of that, because I think we're at the end of result of several hundred years of disconnection, let's say, the whole scientific revolution, and our minds becoming so brilliant, which they are, but then gradually the mind taking over. I don't know if you know Ian McGilchrist's work, but his first book, The Master and His Emissary, based on a very simple folk tale in which in times past the ruler of a kingdom would once a year walk around their whole kingdom. But when the kingdom became too big, the ruler started to have emissaries that he or she would send to take, to help run different parts. But the problem was that those emissaries forgot. They forgot. And his view is that's what happens. That's what's happened to our left brain. It's forgotten that it's supposed to serve. So that's one way of looking at it. And that's culturally ingrained. If you look at our education, it's culturally ingrained from very, very early in our education that thinking is sovereign. And the whole pattern is less and less play, less and less creativity at school, which is why there are many people who develop alternative schools. So that's one reason. And then another reason is that to do the kind of work, the developmental work I'm talking about, requires a lot of understanding of culture and of the territory we need to open up, which I call these two pillars, which is not easy work. Because if leaders need to be willing to face themselves more deeply, that is growing. I mean, it really is growing. I teach at, places like the IMD Business School, and I typically have 40 leaders for 3 days. And we have a tussle. We have a tussle. But within a day or two, almost all are on board, even cognitively are on board. And then the biggest threshold that I experience is almost, because we can do deep body work, and people will suddenly feel, oh, wow, this feels incredible to be back in my body. I've forgotten how good this feels. That's kind of easy in a way. But the big threshold is always the emotional one. And also all the belief systems. It's not okay to be vulnerable. All of that package of belief systems. So we have to approach that. And then we have to have exercises where it becomes safe enough to suddenly be more emotional. And when that happens, as it always does, eventually, at a certain moment in a 3-day work, it's amazing what happens. Because suddenly people are more emotional together and experiencing how incredible that is, what a relief it is on multiple levels, not least to realize that other people have similar fears and sadnesses to me, but also the energy it opens, the connection it opens in a group. But that's very, it takes a lot for that to happen. And it is growing. The whole movement of that is growing. Even the whole field now of what's called trauma-informed coaching is really growing. So there is a big movement happening. I agree with you that could be happening a lot faster, but that's how it is. That's how it is. And I think it's for each of us to really, I lost you for a moment. I don't know where you've gone. You moved on the screen, but it's for each of us to really contribute in the way that we feel is right. I'm going to read one of my favorite quotes because I think it's okay, here we are. I got it straight away. This is by Václav Havel, the great Czech writer who became president of the Czech Republic. And he said, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. So I think for all of us who are engaged in this kind of work, that's an essential quote, because I have no doubt whatsoever that this work makes total sense. And however it turns out is way beyond my my capacity or for me to know. But more and more people are doing this kind of work. Some of the answer to your wonderful big question.
Thank you. No, that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Good. One more. Let's hear from Tamas.
Hey, thanks a lot for the sharing so far. Building on this, my experience when I work with people and I bring them to the body to feel, often I ask them afterwards, do you know what we've done now?
Right.
And it's like, no. And I say, we were just feeling now.
Right.
And building on the previous question, beyond impediments, like how do we effectively explain to leaders what we do prior to engaging with us, even when we even don't know that actually how it is to feel.
Right.
And how do we overcome that obstacle to actually show the importance of this needed work in a way that it actually reached that more rational mind so that they engage in the deeper work.
I'm totally with you on that. And I think we have to dance with the cognitive and the visceral in a very, very clear way.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, my book comes to mind. My book, Leader is Healer, and which to my real astonishment won UK Business Book of the Year last year. And it's a very cognitive wrapping of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes sense. It really makes sense. And it's not complicated, because I think we have to be simple. And I love the way you're speaking about it. We have to be simple. But it has to make sense for people. Mm-hmm. If we're going to approach particularly the more emotional world, people have to understand, why would we do this? Why would we do this?
Okay.
We have to be able to explain it, and we have to be able to explain it in a very coherent way, with a lot of transmission of presence and care.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be very robust in our work, because we're meeting a culture that is often, whose first response will be to reject.
Mm-hmm. So essentially,
I remember, a while ago at the IMD, I started a whole session with quite a large group saying, all of you are operating at about 20% of your full capacity, and you've forgotten that. You just don't realize. And there was actually a Russian man right in the front who very aggressively said to me, "How do you know that?" To which my response was, "You'll see. You'll see." 2.5 days later, he came up to me in tears at the end and said, "Thank you."
Mm-hmm.
So we have to engage the process. We have to engage. And it has to be, you're absolutely right, it has to be cognitively absolutely coherent. Quite rightly so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful how you speak. Good. Thank you all so much for your interest in this and your attentiveness. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I hope this has brought different insights as well. We will do one of these every month, so look forward to seeing some of you next month, and the recording will be available as well. Thank you very, very much, all of you. All of you, thank you. And we need community. We need community. We need community that is interested in this and supports all of us in doing the developmental work that's needed. So thank you very much.